This is the first of what will be many such town halls in the future. Tonight, we are pleased to be joined by two of our local members of Congress to discuss some of the major issues that are impacting our area. We have Virginia Senator Tim Kaine and Maryland Representative Anthony Brown. Good evening to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Jeanette, great to be with you.
Great to be here, Jeanette.
Likewise, likewise.
Let's talk about President Biden. Last night, he talked about several major issues in his joint address to Congress last night. We want you to weigh in on what matters to you. That's been the topic of our Fox 5 Live Insta poll all day long. We've asked you which issue facing the country right now is most important, and it looks like two-thirds of you say it's economic recovery. 67% the economy, an issue that has been an issue as old as time in American politics. Police reform at 10%, foreign policy at 8%. You can vote on the Fox 5 News app. We're going to continue checking these numbers throughout the next half hour. You can also go to fox5dc.com. And Jeanette's here to get us started.
And Jim, you said it there. One of the major concerns for people in the country, including here in our region, is the economy, which of course is tied to the pandemic. President Biden talking about the pandemic and a number of things in his presidential address last night. Let's take a listen.
90% of Americans now live within 5 miles of a vaccination site. Everyone over the age of 16, everyone is now eligible to get vaccinated right now, right away. Go get vaccinated, America. Go and get the vaccination. They're available.
So you heard it there, President Biden asking everyone to get vaccinated now that everybody over the age of 16 can get the shot. I want to turn to you, Congressman and Senator, to talk about this, and specifically with you, Congressman Brown. I know you have been speaking about the inequity when it comes to rolling out the vaccine in your area. How is that going? Is it possible? Is it easier now for the black and brown communities to get the shot?
First of all, let me say it's great to be on with you, Jeanette. Thanks for having me, and with my good friend, Senator Kaine. Look, if we're going to recover the economy, you've got to crush the virus, and we crush the virus with the vaccine. I think it's important to deliver it in an expeditious way, focusing on speed, but you also have to focus on equity. In Maryland, we've got a problem. 30% of Marylanders are African American. Yet African Americans only make up about 24% of those who are vaccinated. So if we're really going to achieve herd immunity, 70 to 75% of Americans vaccinated, you have to slow it down a little bit, focus on those vulnerable communities, hard to reach communities, educate and outreach so that they'll accept the vaccine.
And Senator Kaine, I want to talk to you about that. One of the challenges, of course, from the beginning of the pandemic is making sure everyone had access, and now it's also making sure that demand meets supply. Absolutely. So you've got to provide an incentive. And one of the things that were brought up during the address yesterday was that everyone was wearing a mask. And with the CDC guidelines, there have been some questions as to, what's the point of getting the vaccine if we still have to wear these masks and still follow some relatively strict guidelines?
Look, you want to get the vaccine because you're going to keep yourself safe, your family and your friends safe, and that's the real key. I think mask wearing when you're in events with any crowd, and even though the crowd was not its norm at this address last night, there were a lot of people in that room. So I think mask wearing makes sense. Good news is CDC says when you're outdoors, unless you're around a big crowd, don't need to wear masks anymore. And I can just tell, even walking over to the studio tonight, people are feeling good about this. One of the things I thought was interesting when the poll was just first up, 9% said the vaccine was their top priority. If we'd done this 60 days ago, it probably would have been 65%. So that's a little bit of a measure that people are feeling more comfortable. But as my friend Congressman mentioned, you do have to go out to communities that have been hit hardest. So if Latinos have been hit harder by COVID, African Americans have been hit harder by COVID, you can't just say, okay, first come, first serve, everybody come if you want. You need to go to the communities that are hit harder, sometimes who have the hardest time accessing vaccines, and do the affirmative outreach and make sure that you're in their communities.
Yeah, I know we've talked about reluctance is one thing, but access is also another when it comes to black and brown communities. Jim, I want to send it over to you because I know you also had some questions about this topic.
Let me throw something out very quickly before we move on, and this can either go to the senator or the congressman, because one of the big issues when we talk about vaccine access has been the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, because that was to be for people who would be reluctant to go back and get that second shot. That was crucial. It was a single shot vaccine. We had a handful of clotting incidents. A few of them turned out to be deadly, but it was about 15 out of 6 million shots. Do you think it was wise for the CDC to put the brakes on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine when they did?
I certainly think it was wise that they put the brakes on when they did, because they had an incident, right? One death is one too many, but they had an opportunity to take a look. That's the way the system works, the process works. And still today, the determination is, you are better off with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine than no vaccine at all. Mm-hmm. Without the vaccine, you're vulnerable to being infected by COVID-19, and that'll be more dangerous to you, far more dangerous than any of the vaccines are out there. So, like President Biden said, get vaccinated, whether it's Moderna, Pfizer, or Johnson & Johnson.
And the nice thing about the one-dose vaccine is, we have to not only deal with some hesitance, but there's about 10% of the people who get the first shot of the 2 doses who aren't yet coming back for the second. Maybe they've heard the second dose hits you harder, or maybe they just are busy. That's the virtue of the J&J vaccine. Just the single dose really helps. And I've talked to a lot of people who've had that vaccine. They feel very, very protected once they've gotten it.
I'll tell you what, Senator, I've had that Moderna vaccine. That second one does hit you very hard on the second day, so you have to stay hydrated, but it's worth it in the long run. Let's move on as we talk about the continuing reopening of the country. We know that in the state of Texas, back on March 10th, the governor there, Greg Abbott, a Republican, he announced that they were doing away with mask mandates indoors and outdoors. They were dropping capacity restrictions altogether in businesses. We've seen baseball stadiums filled again. And there were a lot of people, a lot of Democrats, too, who thought that this would be, I know the president had called it Neanderthal thinking. Yet, as you look at the trends, Texas did not see a spike. In fact, they've been on the same trend as it looks like Maryland and Virginia. But you have a state like Michigan where there are very strict guidelines in place. They saw a massive spike that fortunately has been dropping. So, Congressman Brown, do you think it's time maybe to start dropping those restrictions now that we've seen them work in Texas?
First of all, I think we've got to follow the science and take the advice of our public health officials, because for every case where you may have seen a loosening of restrictions and you didn't see a spike, there are certainly plenty of instances around this country where you saw a loosening of restrictions, people didn't use the mask, and you saw spikes in infection. So I say let's follow the science. As we're reopening our schools, let's get our educators vaccinated. We now know that, there are trials that are being done in terms of when it's safe to vaccinate our children. But right now, let's make sure it's available to our educators. Use the PPE in the classrooms. Do as much distancing and class size reduction as possible. And quite frankly, because of the American Rescue Plan, there are dollars available to school districts around this country where they can extend instruction into the summer to make up for lost learning. They can actually build facilities or put up the temporary facilities to reduce the density in classrooms. So there are a lot of resources there to continue following the protocols that the CDC says works.
I do want to move on here, but sticking with COVID specifically, we reached out to our viewers if they had any questions, and there was one from someone who was diagnosed with COVID a few months ago. She says, I caught COVID at 19 years old, and with post-COVID syndrome, I had to stop working in November because of illness. I'm ineligible for pandemic unemployment assistance and Social Security disability insurance. I have $8,000 in medical bills. What are they doing, speaking about lawmakers, of course, to financially support COVID long haulers? And Senator Kaine, I want to direct this to you because we were just talking before we came on here about some of the effects that you have felt almost a year or more than a year after being diagnosed with COVID. So what help is being offered to people like this viewer?
So you're right, Janet, and this viewer, your symptoms are real, that they're happening to about 15 to 20% of people who've had COVID. And the tricky thing about COVID is you could have respiratory symptoms, you could have heart symptoms, you could have fatigue, you could have muscular symptoms. I have mild neurological symptoms, nerve tingling, and a weird heating pad thing that'll pop up and go away and pop up somewhere else. Mine aren't debilitating, don't slow me down, but we have plenty of people who are marathon runners and then they got COVID and they can hardly walk to the end of the block. What's being done? The nice thing is the American Rescue Plan that we passed in early March had significant funding for more COVID research, including directed funds towards studying these long COVID effects. Really, really important for folks like your questioner. Here's something else that's good about vaccines. Many people who've had COVID who are having after effects are reporting if they get the vaccine, the after effects diminish. Not everybody's reporting that, but a lot of people are. So that's something we're studying, but we're going to put sizable dollars into this. I was quizzing Dr. Fauci about it at the last hearing we had before the health community. And so this 15 to 20% of folks with COVID who are still having effects, we know that they're real. We're putting the research in, and we're going to come up with strategies and treatments to try to reduce those effects.
All right. And Jim, I want to send it over to you now to talk about infrastructure.
Yeah, that has been a catchphrase and an idea and a concept that we've been talking about for years now. There was a lot of talk during the Trump administration early on about Infrastructure Week. When would Congress get together and talk about an issue that could unite Democrats and Republicans? That is part of President Biden's American Jobs Plan. He talked about that during his address last night.
Investments in jobs and infrastructure like the ones we're talking about have often had bipartisan support in the past. Vice President Harris and I met regularly in the Oval Office with Democrats and Republicans and discussed the jobs plan. And I applaud a group of Republican senators who just put forward their own proposal. So let's get to work.
So, Congressman Brown, we're talking about a $2.3 trillion proposal here from President Biden. It does include funding for traditional infrastructure, but there are other things that some Republicans have expressed concern about not being part of traditional infrastructure, like child care and elder care. The president talked about some Republicans who have come up with about a $600 billion compromise. $600 billion and $2.3 trillion, those are vastly different numbers, but considering that you have to win over some senators here, it could pass in the House, but in the Senate, is there room for compromise here, or is this an all-or-nothing proposition?
Well, I'll certainly let Senator Kaine speak to the dynamics in the Senate, but let me just say that we've got to go big. This $2.2 trillion is paying for not only road and rail, tunnels and bridges and broadband, but we need to invest in housing, in school facilities and child care facilities, VA hospitals and federal facilities. It's a jobs plan. In fact, the proposal, the counter proposal at about $600 billion or so, if we did nothing, we'd probably spend that money on infrastructure because it's already programmed to be spent. So we're talking about new money, new dollars. Why? To create jobs and opportunities. As we recover this economy, we've got to make sure that every community, every American has an opportunity to get a good family supporting job. That's what this plan does. That's why it's called the American Jobs Plan, and that's why we approach infrastructure very broadly.
And Senator Kaine, we mentioned about the divided Senate. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, the Senate just passed an infrastructure bill today with a 94-2 vote, a Safe Water Drinking Act bill that was worked on very heavily in committee. We did amendment process on the floor, heading to the House now. We felt very good about it. Here's my hope. Both sides want to do infrastructure. Every Republican governor and mayor I know wants to do infrastructure. Organized labor and the Chamber of Commerce wants to do infrastructure. So if we can't agree on everything, at least we ought to be able to agree on a lot. And then, look, if the Republicans want a smaller package, let's work together on what they want. And then Democrats may still decide under very traditional rules in the Senate that we can use. Republicans used them when they had the majority. We may want to do more. But I noticed yesterday I introduced a bill with some colleagues. It was an infrastructure bill to modernize our shipyards. Super bipartisan. And a couple of my Republican colleagues said, we're putting this bill in. Please get in the infrastructure deal. I may not vote for the deal, but you got to get it in the deal. So you're going to see the content of it will be incredibly bipartisan, whatever the ultimate vote's going to be.
I do want to jump in here really quickly before we move on to the next topic, because I know one of the biggest criticisms is there's this very broad definition, non-traditional definition of what infrastructure is. And the plan is just so massive and so expansive that I know Republicans are considering it reckless spending, but also how realistic is it that we can accomplish all of these things within this infrastructure plan?
Yeah, let me give you an example. Some part of the infrastructure plan, road, rail, bridges, broadband, electricity grid, we can agree on all of that. Some part of the infrastructure plan is going to be workforce training. Is that infrastructure? Well, bridges don't build themselves. We got 5 million people who are long-term unemployed because of COVID. They're adult workers. Many want to get back in the workforce, and they want better jobs with better pay and benefits. And if we're going to be doing infrastructure, they're exactly the kind of people we should hire. But they may need an intense short-term training program at a community college to take those infrastructure jobs. So while you might not think community college is traditional infrastructure, we got to have the people to do the work. And that's why the infrastructure definition, as the Congressman said, it's really a jobs plan. Infrastructure's at the heart of it. But we want to put people back to work, rebuilding our country.
And let me just add as well, there's significant investments in research and development and manufacturing. Again, these all create jobs. And if this is a jobs plan and also an American competitiveness plan, if we're going to be competitive, we've got to make sure that we can do advanced manufacturing better than anyone. Right now, we're slipping behind, so we've got to make these investments in the workforce, research and development to make sure that we've got a strong manufacturing base.
All right. Sticking with jobs, I do want to get to another question that a viewer had for us. Let's listen in.
Mr. Brown, what are you going to do about all the unemployed people that need jobs? How are you going to provide jobs for them? Are you really concerned about that, or where is that on your list of things to do?
Yep, absolutely. And what I'm going to do is certainly advocate for the American Jobs Plan, because when we invest in infrastructure, it's not just the jobs that you create for the building trades, the steel worker or the carpenter. When we invest in infrastructure, there is second order and third order benefits. It creates jobs in retail as you have expanding economies. It creates jobs in manufacturing, in so many other sectors. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to support the American Jobs Plan, but I'm also going to support the American Families Plan. Because for many Americans, it's difficult to get to the job and to stay on the job because of family responsibilities and requirements. So if we're not passing the American Family Plan and supporting children and families so that the breadwinner can be out there in the workplace, then any job I create for you, it may not be accessible to you.
And Jim, I want to send it to you for something else that a lot of folks are talking about, especially over the last few weeks.
Yeah, and especially over the last year, too, Jeanette, as we saw it reach a flashpoint here in D.C., we know that there has been a lot of reaction about American policing, and we saw that encapsulate in the reaction from the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial. There's several parts to this question, but first things first, a viewer had this on her mind.
I would just like to know, what would you have in the future for police reform or anything as far as the relationship between the police and the community?
Congressman Brown, you know that that has been a concern for years. I mean, just having that trust between the community and police departments. In Prince George's County, earlier this year, a report came out saying that there were internal problems with discipline and discrimination and racism that led to the chief stepping down. There was an incident yesterday where an officer was indicted because some of his officers say he mistreated a boy in custody, a 17-year-old in custody. So trust has been a big issue for years. How do we start walking down that road to getting people on the side and knowing that there should be good relations between police departments and the communities they serve?
Sure. First of all, I've lived in Prince George's County now for, I think, over 20 years, and we've made progress. When I first moved to Prince George's County, almost daily, we were hearing about police misconduct, brutality, people being hurt and killed in police custody. Those numbers have gone down dramatically, but that's not good enough, as you mentioned in the question, the incidents that you raised. So what we need to do is pass the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which makes investments in training police on how to sort of be the guardian of the community and not have this worry or a more aggressive approach that we see in far too many police departments and far too many police officers. We've got to address things like racial bias, which exists in police departments, even like Prince George's County, that is a majority African-American membership department. But we also have to invest in the leadership in departments. That actually isn't in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. How do we develop law enforcement leadership, sheriffs, and chiefs? So I hope that when it's in the Senate, we can work together to make sure we're focusing on leadership as well.
And I do want to talk about that, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, because we know there is, on both sides of the aisle, there is concern and interest in talking about police reform and coming up with a solution. Qualified immunity seems to be the sticking point. Are you willing to compromise when it comes to qualified immunity, and where do you stand on it?
Absolutely. So the good news in the Senate today, there is a significant bipartisan discussion going between House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans, to try to take kind of a lead Democratic proposal, the George Floyd Policing Act, and lead Republican proposals to see if we can merge them together and find common cause. There's many areas of common cause, some things I'm particularly passionate about. You asked about qualified immunity, and it is a little bit of a sticking point. But look, even a Supreme Court that's dominated now by Republican-appointed justices are saying, in dissenting opinions and others, we've let this create too much of a shield for reckless behavior by police. And it's not an all-or-nothing thing. You can create immunity for the basic everyday policing actions, but not give people immunity for reckless behavior. If you immunize reckless behavior, you get a lot of recklessness. If you dial the immunity doctrines back so that a police department or police officer could be liable for recklessness, suddenly you find everybody wants to reduce the amount of recklessness. I think we've just let the doctrine shield too much even bad behavior, and you can adjust it in ways that you will provide a powerful incentive for reform. And I think that's the path that the discussions are on right now.
Congressman, I want to ask you this. Are you worried, though, that there might be some trouble with messaging? In other words, there is some divide about anti-police and pro-police. And when we have these discussions here, that's where people tend to fall on either side. Do you think that there is some trouble with messaging, that you can have these discussions about police reform and still be pro-police?
Sure. First of all, you don't want to demonize the police. I mean, the vast majority of the men and women who serve in police departments, and there are 18,000 across the country, they raise their right hand, they take an oath to protect and defend, and that's exactly what they do. But when you have a police officer engaged in misconduct, but they're shielded from liability from qualified immunity, difficult, if impossible, to get convictions. What we saw in the Chauvin case is a rare occurrence, even with the kind of evidence that's available today. You don't want to demonize the police, and in fact, I think many of these reforms support the police. Things like body camera. Body camera could be used evidence to exonerate a police who's accused of bad conduct. So I think these reforms, investments in training, because many police officers don't get proper training. At the University of Maryland College Park, there's a professor there that's doing some serious research on racial bias in policing, using technology, virtual technology, to train police to identify the biases that they have that they weren't aware of. And when they do, how do you get beyond your bias, whether it's race, gender, ethnicity? How do you get beyond it so you can be a better police officer? And it's being embraced by departments across the country.
We got about 15 seconds. We want to move on to something else.
If we let students get money to go to college, they have to use those funds at accredited universities. We give funds to police departments. We don't require that they're accredited, even though there's accrediting agencies that do a good job. Asking police departments to be accredited is not anti-police. It's actually pro-police. And the departments that go through accreditation find that it helps with leadership training. It helps with use of force standards. So that's something that we could do that would be pro-accountability, but not anti-police.
Okay. All right, Jim, I'll send it back over to you to studio for the next topic of discussion.
Yeah, Jeanette, U.S.-China relations have always been a key linchpin of American foreign policy. We've seen that dynamic change over the last several years. President Biden met with Chinese President Xi Jinping during the climate summit. He also had this to say about a conversation he had with President Xi.
I told them what I've said to many world leaders, that America will not back away from our commitments, our commitment to human rights and fundamental freedoms, and to our alliances.
Senator Kaine, we know that China has come under pressure, come under international criticism for the way it's treated Uyghur Muslims, as well as other human rights violations. You've been working with some fellow senators, a bipartisan group, to come up with some way to deal with China, but considering the fact that we still have tariffs in place from the Trump era, there are still the same sanctions on technology. Are we seeing the same approach towards China under President Biden that we saw under the former president?
No, I think there is a similarity, but then there's a significant difference. President Trump realized that China was a significant threat, and no amount of wishing by democratic nations around the world or attempts to integrate them into democratic institutions was fundamentally going to change their behavior. That was a good recognition. But what President Trump did wrong was he decided, let's match up against China mano a mano, one-on-one, instead of linking arms with our allies and matching up with a massive strength. So he imposed trade tariffs on Canada and the EU and Mexico that made them all mad when we should have been trying to link arms with those nations to match up against China. So Biden begins with the recognition that Trump started that China is the principal challenge we have this century. But he says we're going to deal with that challenge by linking arms with our allies, calling a summit for democracy later this year where we'll work together with allies who have the same worries that we do about Chinese theft of intellectual property, rapacious trade practices, crackdowns on the Uyghurs. We got a big Uyghur community in Northern Virginia. The stepping on the pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. We got to stand up for human rights, but we'll be a lot stronger if we stand up together with Europe and other democracies around the world.
Yeah. And Congressman, in the last 2 minutes here, I want to stick with foreign policy. Jim, did you want to chime in really quickly?
No, by all means, take it away.
So I want to talk about Afghanistan. We're pulling our troops, the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I know you're a veteran, so I wanted to get your take on this. Do you feel that this could, in terms of security concerns, that those could be heightened pulling our troops out so suddenly?
Well, first of all, I think the approach that the Pentagon under President Biden's leadership, the approach they're taking to withdrawal is smart. We're actually sending a few more troops there because these withdrawal operations are some of the most dangerous operations that face our forces anywhere around the world. So we put more forces in to help with the withdrawal. But it's time to withdraw U.S. troops. Right now, you have a second-generation American, okay, who's going to Afghanistan, whose mother or father fought in that same war. We never intended back in 2001 to be in Afghanistan that long. We set out to defeat al-Qaeda, and we did so. We set out to bring justice to Osama bin Laden. We did so. Now, along the way, we did a lot of good things. We helped them build capacity. We helped women develop more rights and privileges in society. But that wasn't our primary mission. We do need to continue with humanitarian aid, economic assistance, security assistance, but it's time to take our men and women in uniform home.
Do you feel like this is the right move as far as pulling our troops from Afghanistan?
I do. 10 years to kill bin Laden, 10 years to train 500,000 Afghan security forces and police. Our military's done what we can do. I agree with the congressman. We're going to give security assistance, development aid, humanitarian aid, trade, commerce. The 6 nations that border Afghanistan have to play a role because they have a lot at stake in stability in Afghanistan, too, to stop refugees and terrorism. We're going to be a partner of Afghanistan, but the American military has invested for 20 years, and time to bring our troops home.
All right, Jim, I'll send it back over to you.
And before we go tonight, we've been asking everybody all day. We've been getting your pulse of the people online with our Fox 5 Live Instapoll. Which of the issues that we've talked about tonight are the most important to you right now? And it's been pretty much at 66% for economic recovery. It kind of reminds me of the Clinton campaign back in '92 when it's the economy, stupid. 66%, 65% with the economy now. It looks like police reform, COVID vaccine, foreign policy, and infrastructure all on that list. If you weighed in, we really appreciate it. We'll continue to look at this at fox5dc.com, but that is what the pulse of the people is all about, Jeanette.
Yeah, absolutely, and it makes sense. So much of what we talked about, right, impacts the economy.
Yeah.
So we loved hearing from you all. Thanks for sending in your questions, and of course, thank you, Congressman and Senator, for joining us this evening. We appreciate you watching tonight.
In the meantime, I will be back later on tonight with the news at 10 here on Fox 5, and we'll review what we talked about tonight. And we'll talk a little bit more about President Biden's 100 days in office on the final 5. By the way, this is just the first of what we hope will be many Pulse of the People town halls in the future. So, Jeanette, it was great working with you, and we'll see you again soon.
Absolutely, likewise. Have a good night.
You've been watching the Pulse of the People of Fox 5 Town Hall with Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia and Representative Anthony Brown of Maryland.